I am very excited to introduce my guest, and my guest needs quite an introduction because it's a very elaborate intro. Not that she might not need the intro, but I'm going to give it anyway because I think people should know. Blair Imani is a critically acclaimed historian, social activist, public speaker, educator, and influencer. The author of 2 historical books, Modern HERstory, Stories of Women and Non-Binary People Rewriting History and Making Our Way Home, The Great Migration and the Black American Dream. The New York Times praises Blair Imani's unique brand, combining progressive lessons with vibrant visuals and a quirky delivery. Her work centers women and girls, global Black communities, and the LGBTQ plus community. As an influencer and historian, semi-retired organizer, congrats to her on the semi-retirement, and public speaker, Blair Imani is dedicated to making the world a better place and amplifying the voices and work of those fighting the good fight. I am so excited to have her here. Blair Imani, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm rather excited. I've checked out the podcast, think it's fantastic. So let's do it.
I love that. It is Black Women's History Week, by the way.
Yes, it is. And so that's exciting because my friend, actually, Feminista Jones, created it. And while there were like other attempts to do it, I think hers is so innovative. And it's the one that caught on. So truly, it's the most important one to me. But there were attempts to do Black Women's History Week at the end of March. And hers bridges the end of Black History Month and the beginning of Women's History Month, which is intersectional. It's just very perfect. And so every month every day rather of the week has a prompt. And it's been fun to see folks. Like we did one that was like, name a favorite moment in Black women's history. And folks were like, oh man, I have to do some Googles. I'm not sure where to start. And I'm like, that's why learning's a blessing.
Yes, indeed. I love it. And also Feminista Jones, superhero name much? My goodness.
I believe so, cool. Yes. And she lives up to it in every way, every day.
That is a pretty darn cool name. So Blair Imani is pretty cool too. So speaking with you and not Feminista, let me ask you, how do you feel Black Women's History Week is going? We just came off of Black History Month. Give me a little bit of a breakdown as a launching pad.
Okay, so first, Black History Month was extra this year. I think that there were a lot of newly woke white and white passing people who were doing their darndest to do the most. And when do the most is said in Black English, it's not always a great thing. Sometimes it's exhausting. And it was so much. Like I had to deal with sponsors who didn't want me to mention white supremacy, but wanted me to talk about Black History Month. I also had really great sponsors like the Smarties candy, like OG Smarties candy from Trick or Treating. They did a partnership with me, which was really great. But Black Women's History Week, it's been going really well so far. In fact, one school, all of the teachers at the school are making the students use the prompts, the 7-day prompts for Feminista Jones as extra credit. So I've been getting tagged in like the entire class's extra credit post, which is cool. Like, I feel like, I mean, as somebody who relied on extra credit because I was a procrastinator, it's cool to be that resource for people.
I love that. Yeah, I'm one of the great procrastinators myself. So we definitely are simpatico on that. So looking back, this has been quite the year. It's been quite the year for the planet. It's been quite the year for the country. And while we're going through, and by the way, I love the enormous jug of apple juice. I love it.
Gotta do it. Hashtag not sponsored though. Hit me up, Martinelli's.
That Martinelli's would be a dream sponsor. So it's been such an all-encompassing year. So much has happened. And it's been a year when obviously Black Lives Matter jumped to the forefront of the mind of the nation in a way it hadn't really before. Do you think any real gains have thus far been made from that? Obviously, it's a lifelong journey, but where do you think we've come at all during this last year?
I will say that millions more people are aware of racism, which is great. The thing is, some of those people are very keen to police everyone else. So, for example, I have a bunch of people on a daily basis telling me that I'm not being Black correctly who didn't know that racism was a thing before June 1st, 2020, which is the day when it all happened. Because it was like the
non-Black people saying that?
Oh, yeah, all day. Oh. I mean, so it was kind of the coalescing forces of the woman in the park in Central Park, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and the protests because people were unable to move away from the reality. They couldn't go on vacation. They couldn't chill, even though Ted Cruz attempted to do that anyway. They had to sit with the discomfort.
His kids made him.
that poor oppressed man. So I think that as far as gains, it's going to be hard to tell. I think that there are a lot of people who were making promises that they couldn't keep, and they tried to, own up to those during Black History Month, which is why it was so chaotic. But I think on balance, like this time last year, I had 50,000 followers that I had worked over 5 years to gain, and I'd never anticipated I'd be an influencer. Now I have like more people than live in Honolulu following me. I have like 380,000 plus people who are all very engaged. So it's hard to tell if we're going based on who we've lost in the progress, then that's, we'll always think of it as losing. But I really think that there are so many people who are more compassionate or who are more concerned, or at least who are more aware of what they don't know and who are listening and doing it on a consistent basis. And I've just seen so many hearts and minds change, and like just precious things, like my friends who have never really previously dealt with their privilege. Their kids are now saying things like, when I grow up, I want to be an activist. And they're like planning stuff. And they're like, Mom, I don't want to wear that. It's fast fashion. Like, that's adorable. Like, if you can impact people's kids, you have change.
That is the key. That is the key for sure. And I think that's a pretty good marker of progress you just cited there, to be able to become an influencer without having to post bikini selfies. It's almost never done.
It almost isn't. One of the first things I did post was a burkini selfie, which is like full coverage. It was so interesting because I think the key is like, what I like seeing is that there's been so many of us who've gone viral because our work is in anti-racism, and people decided to start caring about anti-racism. And I haven't had to change my approach this whole time. And it's like, it's been really validating for me, because if you're trying something and you know that it should be true and you know that you're good at it, but people aren't paying attention, you can start thinking, oh, maybe what I'm doing is wrong. And when I went viral, it validated for me that like, oh, okay, so I'm doing the right things. Y'all just didn't care about racism before. Awesome. And then I have to not get all super angsty about it and just be like, okay, I'm glad you're here. I'm not going to be mad about the fact that y'all have been ignoring us it's fine. So there's that constant part too.
Yes, it's true. There's a comedian, Gary Gulman, who said that if you just put away your social media, not posting, but looking at the comments and looking at the responses for like 6 months, you'll be surprised at how far you can get. But I'm incapable of doing that.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I took a break from Twitter and I went back, and when I got back, so while I was off Twitter, I was like, I don't like what the Jeopardy host is wearing, but I'm not going to yell at it on the internet. I'm just going to sit with those thoughts because I can't change it anyway. And it was just like reframing those things. But I mean, sometimes you got to turn the comments off. I got posted on the Instagram page, like Instagram. I was just like,
Blair, you are breaking up something awful. I was trying to follow the robot sounds, but now I can't hear it.
Oh no. A few apps.
Good Lord. Now maybe it's trying to come back. It's pixelated. It's a mess. But I'm going to guess what you were saying. You were saying that I'm a great interviewer and you're very impressed so far and you're loving it. And now you're coming back into shape, face coming back into form.
There we go. I'm closing a bunch of apps.
Oh, nice.
Oh, oops.
Whoops.
Whoopsie doozy. I closed. Okay, we're back. So
you closed all the apps, including this one. Perfect.
My bad.
No worries.
So we're back. We're back, and I'm still Black, and it's still Black Women's History Week.
And you're better than ever.
Thank you. And so I think that yeah, it's hard to the social media is engineered to make us click on everything at all times and be super governed by how distressing it is. But we got to know that and then govern our lives accordingly, because you can get lost in the sauce if you want to, but it should be a choice. It shouldn't just be like brainwashing. Agreed
with that. So there's plenty of more meaningful things to get lost in the sauce of, and you take on so many of them. So, as I said in your bio, you're a semi-retired organizer. Where'd the burnout come from? And it seems like you're basically still doing it, but you're just doing it digitally. So explain that process.
So being an organizer, moving people, getting folks to come to places to do protests and stuff. The government doesn't love that with people, but nobody's attacking historians. So I kind of took a calculated risk when I kind of shifted what I do. I'm still very much active in the work that I do, but when they start calling the insurrectionists at the Capitol activists, it starts to lose meaning. So I'm cool. And so as a historian, I feel like it's still very much what I do, and people call me an activist historian because I tell the truth instead of like the Europe. Like, for example, folks will say that last names came out of the 12th century in Europe, but meanwhile in Japan for like 1,000 years before, they've been using last names. So like, what's the truth? And if I tell the truth, people are like, oh my gosh, what an activist. And I'm just like, okay, the bar is so low. So people aren't coming after historians the same way they're coming after organizers. So I feel much more secure in doing that. And so a lot of my work is very similar, but it's still motivating people to come to a place, and you never really lose that skill. It just becomes increasingly difficult to sustain that work. But I mean, the burnout comes from like, oh, I'm really tired, I need to nap. But if I nap right now, I could be organizing a protest to end hunger in this city. Like, and then it kind of becomes impossible for you to nap. And so there's actually a site called the Nap Ministry that talks about how rest is revolutionary. Speaking of just taking naps, highly recommend. But it's really
religion.
easy.
I have just found religion. Oh my
There
goodness.
you go. Amen. And so I think that it's easy to get bogged down when we feel like we're the only ones who can solve a problem. And the solution to that is to start building networks. And it's really hard to do with a pandemic, but like small things to fight isolation, like writing letters to people, texting people, getting on the phone and not only Zooms, those types of things to really deepen your connections to other people. That's how you prevent yourself from getting burnout, and making sure that you're not the only one doing it. You're passing on that education as well. And as an educator, I'm constantly just seeing the fruits of that work, like just seeing people apply the work and approach it properly in real time. That's something that like is so rejuvenating, because you work super hard on a lesson and then people like it and they're like, hey, I learned this from you. It's like, what? Like, yesterday I did a lesson on woman with an X, and how when people use it to label people who are women and who are not women as an umbrella term, that's harmful. Keeping in mind that cisgender women are women and transgender women are women, but non-binary folks who specifically don't describe themselves as women shouldn't be applied this label as an umbrella, because that's not inclusion, that's rude. And so
you're saying WOMXN.
Yeah. And so I don't know how to pronounce that either. So that's another reason why it sucks. But as soon as I posted it, an hour later, my smarties, who that's what I call my followers, were like, hey, company, you posted this. Blair just educated about it. And I just learned about it 2 seconds ago, but it's wrong and you should know that and you're bad for doing it. And I'm like, oh, wow. Okay. Maybe the last part can be left out. But people are clearly, absorbing the lesson.
Yeah, that's the most important part of it. People do take the ball and run with it sometimes. But so that I guess leads to what I'm curious about next, is that you take on so many issues, not that we can ever prioritize an order of what to tackle, but it feels like sometimes part of the reason why we don't solve anything is because we're always kind of like dipping our toe into so many different things. How do you focus your efforts? And like, if you could state if you have one or two specific biggest goals, what would they be in your work?
I think the big goals is for everyone to recognize each other's humanity at all times. So like, not to dehumanize people. We do that a lot. Like, oh, that person sucks. Like, then it turns into, and that person is a lesser form of life. Like, okay, stop short of that. Maybe attack what they've done wrong, but not that person, because that's not healthy for us or the other person. And it doesn't mean we have to be best friends with everybody. It just means that like, hey, at all times, all humans are human and should be treated like humans, even when we hate them and they're murderers. Like, just treat people like people. That's all, And so doesn't mean trust them. Doesn't mean intermingle with them at all times. It just means like humanity first, period. And so that's a huge thing for me. Of course, I say that, and like it reveals one of my like non-priorities, which is like animal rights is a concern for me, but I don't concern myself with the conversation around speciesism. And if you haven't learned what that gem of a word is, it's when you only care about one species. And I care about the human species the most, and that doesn't make me a bad person. And so like, you can get really burnt out if you're feeling like you have to be at everyone else's level of wokeness or understanding or concern. But the key is to, as it relates to my focuses, is to find the interconnections between them. So when it comes to white supremacy is held up by anti-Blackness and anti-Semitism and patriarchy and homophobia and all these other things and ableism. And so if I'm fighting white supremacy, I'm not just going to do that at one axis. I'm going to make sure that I'm including all the people who are harmed by it and move forward accordingly. And then when you start doing that, and you start looking at things like decolonization, not just the outcomes of colonization, which are things like borders capitalism, etc. But going back to the root of it, and you fight the root, a lot of the things get relieved. And if we look at things like that, then it starts to connect to, oh, okay, well, if there's such an overemphasis on the way that we do agriculture and people are being harmed as we're doing agriculture, oh, then we can take care of the planet as well, because it's all very much interconnected. So the work gets done. But as far as like sitting in one bucket and being like, okay, well, right now I'm climate justice. Right now I'm Black justice. Right now I'm gay justice. It's like, surprise, there's a Black gay person living in a food desert that is also super overpolluted because of redlining. So let's focus on redlining, and that will start taking care of the outcomes instead of thinking it as like it being siloed completely all the time.
That's really smart. Yeah, I was having a conversation with Tiffany Haddish about this recently, and she was saying about how, and she was talking about it more specifically, but she was saying that Black people and Jewish people really have to team up because we're fighting the same problems. And if we keep fighting it just with our own group towards the oppressing party, it's just so much weaker. It's not as much strength in numbers. And if we can just all kind of combine and say, as a humanity, these are the things we're doing wrong and these are the things we're doing right, we should be able to tackle problems more, because then they can get painted more clearly, not as just this group wants this fixed, we want this fixed for us. It's that you're being dicks, you're being evil people, we're being good. Those are not, because we're the thing I can't get over, and I wonder if you have any insight into this, is that we're stuck so much in this ridiculous place lately in our society where evil, ridiculous, hurtful, marginalizing opinions are given equal say as though they're valid, as though that's just two sides to a debate. You'll say something about human rights in a political argument, and somebody will reply and say, don't hate me because of my political opinions. Political is life. It's everything.
Yeah, there's so many things that relate to that. So when we understand politics and political beliefs are related to how we believe power should be distributed. And if you believe that the way that power should be distributed is to fuck everybody else over, can I cuss?
Yes, you can.
To fuck everyone else. So it's so nice. I'm often teaching 5th graders and I feel bad and they know the words, but I'm not allowed to say them. It's like a weird song and dance. Anyway, so
you
yeah,
have them say it. Be like, everybody with me.
1, 2, 3, fuck. Okay, so no, if your political belief, the belief that you have about how power should be distributed is that it should only belong to white, cisgender, straight, Christian men, that's fucked up. I don't have to respect that, because you also simultaneously believe that I'm not a person. So why would I even approach the conversation if you don't even think I'm a person? Like, that is so bonkers. But time and again, we see it. Like, and it's because of how our society is organized. We have folks like Thomas Jefferson who wrote, all men are created equal, da 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 da, while also enslaving 600 people in his lifetime. We don't get from that point to both sides of the argument in separate forms. It's together. It's because we highlight the people who are sometimes the most harmful and only look at the best things, and then take people who are more marginalized and look at the worst things. And we do that to each other in communities. And going back to your example, we have white supremacy in the United States, which is anti-Blackness and anti-Semitism, which means that even within Black communities, you're going to have anti-Blackness and have anti-Semitism. And within Jewish communities, you're going to have anti-Blackness and anti-Semitism, because we see it laterally as well. But the big lie is that we then look at each other as distinctly anti-Black or distinctly anti-Semitic, instead of, and then also the lie that we never work together. How do you think Motown happened, for example? And so,
Good point.
I mean, with comedy, with music, with just so many beautiful different creations. There's also so many health programs that happened during Reconstruction that were, forwarded by Jewish people. Also, Black people and Jewish people continue to live together. I lived right next to the Orthodox folks when I was in Brooklyn. And in Harlem, there's a lot of Jewish folks who live right next to Black folks. Everybody is being affected by gentrification. But it's the lie of the white supremacy for us to not look at what is, oppressing us, and to look at each other. And there's a great political cartoon. I wish I had it offhand, but it's basically like a big boot, and the big boot is capitalism. And you have poor white people, Jewish people, and Black people all being like, hey, get out of my space. And the boot's literally crushing all of us and we're all dying. And that's kind of a perfect encapsulation, but it happens across various communities. We see this with straight cisgender white women feeling like they need to marginalize everyone who is also affected by patriarchy by denying access to womanhood. And what we see with that, specifically as it relates to trans folks in the UK, cisgender women, and for vocab, cisgender means that you were assigned a gender at birth and you still believe, identify as that gender. Transgender means you were assigned a gender at birth you no longer identify as that gender. You're no longer that gender. That's all the difference is, NBD. And so in the UK, these cisgender women were trying to say, there's only one way to be a person. You can't get hormone replacement therapy through the National Health Service. Well, guess what? During menopause, people who are, well, it really depends on chromosomes and stuff, but usually people with a sex category female start to lose their estrogen and develop more testosterone, which is why you see granny with little chin hairs and stuff. And usually people take estrogen for that to also alleviate hot flashes as your hormones change and everything. Well, guess who can't get hormone replacement because y'all were going to be transphobic? The cisgender folks. So we are simultaneously harmed by the things that we think that can be used to oppress others. Because when we look at things like civil rights movements, when we look at things like fighting for reparations, fighting for civil rights improvements, that benefits everybody. There are very few people out here who are organizing only for themselves, because liberation is not about trying to get yourself free and fuck everybody else over. That's just duplicating oppression.
For sure. And I think that's something that I never also understand, why even people who have beliefs that are antiquated and are marginalizing of certain people, why they don't just realize it's to their benefit to get over that anyway, because a rising tide raises all ships. And because wouldn't you rather live in a more harmonious society? Even if you think transgender people are weird, think it privately, don't say it publicly, because you're not having a warring society. We're not constantly having to fight these battles publicly. It's a joke I was trying to develop the other day. I haven't said it out loud yet, so I don't know if it works, and hopefully it's not offensive. But the premise kind of being that you don't need to embrace every group or just like you don't embrace every person privately. Obviously, we hope everybody evolves and starts to embrace everybody. But to say that transgender people, for example, or anybody in the LGBT community deserves the same rights doesn't mean you have to personally approve. Because
I think abortion's a great example. Like, you don't have to personally want an abortion for abortion to be legal.
Exactly.
That's a great example. And so,
just like
but the thing is,
just like you don't approve of the guest host of Jeopardy's suit. My whole premise of the joke is that we can still say what we want privately. You can see somebody who you give all their human rights and respect to and treat them human, and go home to your significant other and be like, what was that about? And talk it out, and even talk some shit if you want privately, but just don't do that in the public square. That's what makes you a good person. We all talk a little shit sometimes.
I think that the issue too, because like I'm kind of the opinion, like I did a quiz, I do pop quizzes on my page, and I was like, when is it okay to say the N-word? And I was like, if a Black person gives you permission, and like under the premise that you're not Black, a Black person gives you permission.
I thought it's
never. Not only never, but I had one of the wrong answers be when you're privately at home and you say it into a pillow. Like, no, but it's because when we do that, we participate in dehumanization. And so even if you think something like, thinking something's weird, like that means usually not in the norm. But if you think something's bad and it's just a different way of being, that's going to affect how you treat people. So the whole things as it relates to, anti-Blackness, as it relates to immigrant rights and xenophobia, as it relates to anti-Semitism, if you buy into any element of that thing, when the time comes, and it will, that people start targeting that group, subconsciously, you've already normalized an understanding that you're okay with their dehumanization, which means you start turning an unseeing eye to folks who are being deported. You stop caring about, or like what we see with the Capitol riots, where folks were super woke on anti-Blackness, but we're not paying attention to anti-Semitism. And we're not talking about these super anti-Semitic tropes that the different insurrectionist folks were fighting. And so that directly connects to that proliferating and to people being harmed. We've seen that with anti-Asian hate crimes, where people are looking at this very narrow understanding of what it means to be Asian in America. And we're seeing these hate crimes. And then when there are those hate crimes and people are being killed and harmed, then everyone cares. But it doesn't have to get to that point if we have a shift in conscience. So it's connected to that. And I think it's also because we don't do the work of loving ourselves in a way that is healthy. Oftentimes, thin people love themselves because they're thin and not fat. Mm-hmm. Sometimes white people love themselves because they're white and they're not Black. Like, it's not that people are secure in who they are, period. It's that oftentimes we're looking at, well, at least I'm not that. That's a sinner group. That's a bad group. That's an out group. I'm not that, which makes me good. And if we have an understanding as a people, like as a community, as a human society and all that jazz, where people understand that they are inherently worthy of respect and that other people are inherently worthy of respect, then the conversation about housing unhoused people isn't that, well, that person doesn't work, they don't deserve what I have. It's that actually no one should have to work to survive in such a wealthy society when Jeff Bezos is out here just, Scrooge McDucking into fucking coins.
This is true. No, that's a very good point. I guess the way I mean it is certainly never putting judgment on good or bad or I'm better or you're worse. It's my point is that you can not be all about something and not judge it. It cannot be for you.
Against it. Yeah. You don't have to be like vehemently against some shit. Like right now, me and vegans, we're really having a hard time because I have a lot of vegans who like want me to be vegan and not happening. And like, I decided to do some lessons on veganism instead because I feel like it's good to get like some good education out there. That's how I approached it. But I'm not going to go and like turn my whole life into being like, I can't stand the vegans. Like I have too much shit to be doing to be organizing my entire life around some shit I don't, not totally about. I get it. It's over there. Not for me. Fine. I'm not going to go and try to fight legislation against veganism. Exactly. But there are things that are, if it's harmful, right? So if veganism also like included like sacrifice of like people instead to like pay back the spirits of animals or some shit, like I hopefully that's not real, but let's pretend. Okay. So then that would be a cool thing to be against because it's harmful. But if something is just out there and it's just a different way of being and it doesn't affect you, then leave it the fuck alone and make sure. And the other step is not just live and let live, but protect that person's right to live and not be harmed. That's the other step that has to happen.
We have to be willing to fight for people who even we might not understand.
And it's not like when we say that too, though, because the people are like, when people say that, like, oh, we have to, respect the people that we might not agree with, they immediately jump to the white supremacists. And I'm like, no, it's a trick of society that we humanize the people that have all of the humanity at all times. Like when we talk about Me Too being unfair, we're not thinking about all of the people who don't have the means to get accountability because they've been harmed. We're thinking about those poor oppressive people who are abusers and whose careers are being ruined.
No, and so that's when the line gets drawn is except for the oppressors. You do not, that is the bad group. There is judgment allowed. And that's when somebody is oppressing others, judging others and trying to keep others down. When they're that boot, yeah, you're going to cut that boot off. That boot needs to be burned.
It has to go. Period. 100%. So that's the step. I think that when people think like when I say humanity towards others, respecting each other, and also fuck shit needs to be out there. Like, no, we're not doing the fuck shit. We're not doing oppression. We're not doing abuse. Yeah. It's about the people who just want to live and are denied that life because of who they are. And not because of who they are, but because the way the systems of oppression are constructed to harm them.
Yes. And those are things that need so much of a collective effort to unwind that if you don't realize that we can't keep being derailed by this false equivalency, this whataboutism that keeps pulling us into, but the other side, it's like when Trump did that speech saying about the squad, right? They should, if they don't like it here, go back to the country they came from, aside from the fact that 3 of the 4 were from this country, which is just insane. It doesn't make sense. But I was tweeting, if you don't respect the fact that this country is meant to be inclusive of everybody and that this is a melting pot and that all people are welcome here, you should get the fuck out.
Period. And I have raised at least $1,000 off of bigots telling me to go back to where I'm from. I'm from Los Angeles, California. My parents, Los Angeles. My grandparents, Los Angeles. Before that, slavery. That's why I'm here. And so like, I didn't even choose to be here. That's the fucked up thing. But I'll have people who are like, I'll be like, all right, I'm taking the message. This is like 2016, 2017. I'll get out of this country, but I need relocation expenses. So I put up my PayPal and people would be sending me money. And I donated that to immigrants' rights organizations and refugee rights organizations. Because people are so, thank you. People are so illogical with their hate that they will put money behind something that they don't even really understand just because they want an immediate solution. So weaponize that, but it's just so ridiculous because even with, I had done some stuff around the 4th of July and have the 4th of July Independence Day, but also like kind of a lie because a lot of people were oppressed, most of the folks in the country. And people were like, go back to where you're from. And I'm like, I'm sorry, but your incompetent president made it so all the borders are shut to us. I would love to go, but y'all suck. So it's like, what is the truth? It's not logical. And I think that what also troubles me, and when people look at like the insurrectionists at the Capitol, white supremacists, and they go, well, they're just stupid, they're harmless, whatever, they just have guns. No, they can be, we don't have to have a negotiation of intelligence before we just objectively say they have access to shit that they shouldn't have access to, weapons, and they have access to places they shouldn't have access to, society, because they're harmful.
And they get leeway from cops that wouldn't give most other groups leeway because they identify with them secretly and or are cool with them, and or the president is legitimately saying, go in there and do what you got to do.
There were more police at the protest I was arrested at than there were at the Capitol riots for quite some time, which is just like a fact that you just have to sit with. And then when people kind of like challenge you, they're like, oh my gosh, why don't you stand for the Pledge of Allegiance? And you're just like with that in your mind. And you're just like, it's all I can do not to scream at all times, you know?
Yes. I mean, that is such a good point right there, is that, and that's something that I've been talking a lot about lately, is that it just is becoming, we're not trying to make this so. Like, my grandfather was a Republican. He was my hero. Republican Party historically has stood for some really great things in the past, but it has now become the party of white supremacy. It's become the party of oppression. It's become the party of greed, ultimate greed, and just keeping people down. Oftentimes it seems just to be a dick, just to be spiteful, just to be mean. It's unreal how reflexively they take that opinion. And so it seems always that people on the right in this country are protesting against people's rights, and people on the left are protesting for people's rights. And those are not equal things. Why are there more cops at a protest for Alton Sterling protesting for human rights, for dignity of people, for lives not to be snuffed out randomly, and there's less at a thing protecting our democracy, and they're trying to take away the right to vote, invalidate the election, and they're saying, let's not guard that. They fight against someone's right to choose. They fight against the ability of all people to be treated equally.
But they do that shit. They make abortion illegal, and then they remove all of the programs that help single moms. They remove all of the programs that allow them to continue their education and to get something that will actually make sure that kid isn't suffering, isn't malnourished. So they're just fucking everybody up from all angles. And it's about retaining power. And I think that an important part of the left-right discussion is that like all of this country was built on some bullshit, and we just continue to not look at it. And then, I mean, I did a deep dive into Abraham Lincoln being massively racist, but he's been so, like, I don't know, woke washed. Is that a thing? We'll call it that. He's been so woke washed. Like, at the end of his last speech he gave before he was assassinated, he said, if Louisiana has to let the black people vote, he said Negroes, has to let Negroes vote, cool. If they can't, cool, as long as they join the union. And people were like, wow, Abraham Lincoln at the end of his life completely and unequivocally supported black people voting. And it's like, how did you get that from there? He was just kind of, I'm not going to be the president to fuck up this shit. And that permeates through everything. And so my partner, Akeem, throughout December and the beginning of January was writing about for the National Security Program at London King's College, what it's like to have this white supremacy and to know we have the stats on the rise of, white supremacists joining the police force. But it's about the lack of policy. And we still are in this place where we're looking at it as a lack of information. We don't know where they are. No, we know exactly where they are. We know where all of them live. We just don't do anything about it because we are such a white supremacist institution. We struggle with looking at white supremacy, even if it's harmful to us. And it is. I mean, you can see, the bombing at the Atlanta Olympics was an anti-choice white supremacist. And like these things are intimately connected, but we can only focus on making shit up like black identity extremists, which we were all labeled after the protest. Black people who want to be alive. What a dangerous terroristic group.
That's an extreme opinion, Blair. Wanting to be alive, who says you get that right?
I know. Who really? Who truly? And shame on me for not being white. Like, it's a mess. And so it's just constant. And it's because we woke wash everything instead of looking at the real context of anti-Semitism in this country and how Jewish people were denied refugee status here. That's why my grandfather was in Detroit in the early 40s. The only reason why he got here was because his father, Vasil Lupu, was able to designate himself as a Christian on paperwork, come in through Cuba, and then go to Detroit. Otherwise, they would have been harmed. They would have been targeted as Jewish people. And so it is very interconnected. And people get really confused when I tell that story because they're like, Blair, are you also Jewish? You can't be all the things. I can, first of all. But he adopted my mom. And so just to see that, we have none of that context. And so we are told to be happy about things and we're blamed for those things. And kids grow up thinking that it's their personal failure that shit is so bad when it's really designed to be this bad. It doesn't have to be this bad. Like people say the Black women's wealth gap could be closed in the next 50 years. That shit could be closed tomorrow. Biden could sign some shit saying you have to pay everybody at your firm the same amount if they're in the same position. That would close that gap, but there's no transparency, and it's because of power. It's political beliefs. It's beliefs about the distribution of power, the distribution of capital, based on race, based on gender, ability, etc. And it's fucked, but it's right there. So my whole thing, my goal is to just get people on the same page about it, because I think a lot of people just aren't. People are just like, I'm sorry, I thought there were two genders. And I explain it, and they're like, oh, everything's aligned. I'm like, yes, great, welcome. And if we can get more folks on that same page, then we can regroup and fix this shit.
Well said. Do you think any part of it is that people are so defensive about their own group that they sometimes close their ears? Like I'm just kind of just thinking top of my head here, but like potentially maybe instead of saying we have to stop white supremacy, saying we have to stop group supremacy. We have to stop the concept that any group thinks they're better than anybody else. Then it becomes about humanity.
Well, then we get legislation like why we have such strict gun laws in California, which is because the Black Panther Party was, getting guns to protect their own communities. And it becomes about conflating pride in an oppressed and marginalized group with supremacy. So that sounds good, but but that keeps being what's pushed. And then there's pushes about like, oh, we shouldn't be talking about. My mom says all the time, your whole defund police thing, it's very scary. You're not going to work, but it has to be that, because in America we're not a country of nuances. This is not France. Nuance means shade in French. It's not something that's like, oh, we just, we're not Canada. Sorry, Canada, we're not, we're very extreme. So why would we put the things that are so life and death into the softest terms? That's what the Democratic Party does. They try to go to the middle every time, and it fucks the shit up. We have to, the one thing that I will say about the right is they are great at marketing.
So good.
And they're well resourced. They make shit up. That shit is catchy. It's horrible, but that shit's catchy. And we have to get out of our own asses as liberals and as progressives and being so cherished about this elitist, well, I have the knowledge and you don't. Shame on you for not knowing. Like during the insurrection, people were like, don't you know that's not how a thing works? No, people don't know this shit because our schools are underfunded, which you should be fighting for instead of telling people that they don't know anything. It's just ridiculous. And so the ego has to go. And we see it with the polls that come out around Republicans voting, that these people are less educated, whatever. Why? It's because it's more viable for these people to go serve overseas to be able to stay in their families than it is for them to go to school and have a path, because all those schools are defunded by, yes, the same group that they're voting for, but it's beneficial for them to do that. So we have to understand from a humanity perspective, like you were saying, that everybody wants to work in their own best interest. And sometimes they conflate their own best interest with power and their access to power, which is why so many Americans think that they're middle class when they're actually living in poverty. They're impoverished. And I think that it's just the sociologists who are writing about it are not the easiest to read. And that's a function of academia. A lot of the answers are there, but they're not out in the world, and it doesn't get put onto prime time because it's not the most interesting thing to watch. So that's my lane, making that shit interesting and easy to understand. But I wish it was so easy.
Yeah, but that's the most important. That's really that's why your work is so interesting. Smarter in Seconds. You watch a 30-second video from you and you learn so much about an issue that people just hear and they don't take the time to study or learn about. You can learn the basic premises of it in 28 seconds. It's really, really helpful. And everybody should follow at Blair Imani on Instagram and search the hashtag Smarter in Seconds. You'll be educated in 5 minutes on 20 topics. It's pretty incredible.
Thank you. And I made it because my mom, literally that's her attention span. If it's not The View or Entertainment Tonight or People Magazine, she's kind of like, sorry, sis. And it's like, she hasn't read any of my books and she thinks I don't know, but she hasn't. And so I'm trying to figure out how I get somebody who's like my dad, who's super cerebral, went to school in Boston, which means Harvard, and who's interested in all the deep dives, and then somebody who just doesn't give a shit. But if I put it in her language and if I make it interesting, she'll pay attention to it. And now it's a book deal. So that book will be coming out at the end of the year. And it's basically a codex of all of my trying to do a deep dive into academia, but make it in plain language, because we're not going to pedagogy and epistemological and obfuscate ourselves out of oppression.
True that. Yeah. I barely know 1/3 of those words. So I totally.
Yeah. So I don't drink anymore, but if I played a drinking game, it would be to read academic articles. And every time you came across the word reify, which means to make more concrete, which I learned last year, you'd be shit-faced reading some of these articles.
Yeah, that's the key, is we have to use those Frank Luntz words that work, that the Republicans use so well, that the right uses so well. Trump was brilliant at that too. It's his best skill. It's just knowing how to give a nickname and a catchphrase and just people run with it. He should have had a different life in marketing, and he would have made his billions of dollars and not ruin the planet. But so what you're doing a lot is helping to set on fire the movements that people need to be able to catch on, to hold on to these ideas in much more attainable, easy to grab ways, which is beautiful. I guess my last big question is, how do we combat, to me, I'm still not finding any really good answers to this. And to me, it's the biggest question currently of our time that so sadly, really Trump accelerated so badly, is how do we get truth back? Because now you'll get this horrible list of terrible things that the other side does, and their followers will literally say it's not true. I mean, Trump will admit that it's his followers at the Capitol. And then I see interviews on Instagram last night, people being like, that was Antifa, that was actors, that was paid, that was fake. How do we get any semblance of progress when we can't even get a semblance of truth going?
I'll tell you what doesn't work and what I think might work, because I was doing some research on this. A lot of folks think that the solution is to have non-biased news, which again participates in that bullshit other side fuckery, and to find a centrist person, a Walter Cronkite, who's going to be secretly racist to himself and cover things when it's objectively the worst. I'll cover Selma when it's literally something I can't turn away from, but I'm not going to humanize Black people consistently. I don't think that works. That's what we've been doing forever. There's a book that I have called Colorblind. I don't know where it is, but it's Colorblind. The White Woman Looks at the Negro. And she in 1946, when she would say things like, Black people are just Black because of the equator and and we should be accepting them, even though they smell different. So like high key 1946 racism. But the stuff that she was suggesting is what we're suggesting in 2020. Buy books from Black people, hire Black speakers, read Black authors, all these different things. But if we've been trying that, what hasn't changed? And so one is we have to get rid of this cowardice to not say when something's bullshit, and to sit with that and not re-fortify it. And I think in the UK, they've done somewhat of a good job on it, with the exception of Brexit and also imperialism. But recently, at least, they have a lot of policy around who can pay for what and a lot of transparency about it. So on the BBC, they can't have any paid product placements on any of their shows. They can't have any advertisements during the podcast, which has really had to keep them honest, because they aren't beholden to a sponsor to keep that honest. But also, people have to have a shift in conscience, because I don't have wealth to redistribute. I got some money to redistribute. That's some different things, But if we can take care of ourselves and then look beyond what is immediately in our best interest, the only thing that keeps people or keeps institutions going is people. And people have to know that and look at the protection that they have, and also be, giving a fuck about changing things for the better. But a lot of people don't, and we can't make them. But I've seen it since Trump left power, because he wasn't taken out of power by any means, that as soon as Twitter was absolutely sure that they couldn't get fucked over by taking him off the platform and their investors weren't going to be harmed or whatever, they took him off. And then you're seeing Reuters really name things like Trump repeats lies. If we started out with like that a year before he was president, we wouldn't have laughed him all the way into the office. And so I think that it's also looking at these things. So like McGraw-Hill and all these different textbooks in Texas and California, they set what the textbooks are for the rest of the country. And they're going to reinforce things that are lies. They're going to say things like enslaved people were workers. They're going to help to fortify these anti-Semitic claims of conspiracy, because they can. And so it's kind of making apparent all of these hidden things, but also intimately knowing throughout that the people who are empowered to maintain power, not to make themselves obsolete. And a lot of what's going to take place is that people are going to have to recognize, okay, maybe it's not best for this show to be on the air forever. Not your show's great. But like, whatever primetime show to be on the air, maybe the ratings that we get from Tucker Carlson tonight isn't worth all the harm that he does to people. And that's somebody who came out on his show on accident.
That was quite a clip.
Thank you. And so it's just, people have to be understanding that what is the most clickable isn't what's the best thing. And what I'm really interested in right now is with tech companies. I meet a lot with different tech companies to try to change their policies, to understand that like they have to be they have to be concerned, but they don't always care. But if we get Section 230 passed, which will shift it from being an internet service provider on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook, to being a publisher where they are responsible for what goes up on their page, they'll have to make those changes. So in that case, legislation becomes very powerful. But again, don't hold your breath, because there are so many lobbying groups that will exist to try to prevent that from happening.
Of course, but also it's very much what we're saying. You were saying a minute ago about the phraseology and the branding of stuff. It needs to be shock. All Republicans just vote against $1,400 stimulus checks. Shock. All Republicans in the House just vote against human rights. Disgust. Shock. We need to use those tactics to frame it, so at least we can get past some of the lies and some of the framing. We can just at least slowly start to push more. We are seeing the country get more and more blue and more accepting of all of these different opinions, new realities, evolving realities, which I guess that brings me to one last question. I know I said that already, but you brought something up that I just remembered was what you and I were going back and forth for a minute in DM on Twitter, on Instagram about, was you said that you didn't think Harriet Tubman should be on the 20. And I was so confused by that because...
Oh, but I found something that we can honor her with, though. I was actually excited to talk to you about this.
Oh, cool.
So for context, y'all, Harriet Tubman in her lifetime, because of capitalism, because of exploitation, was enslaved. And it wasn't years and years ago. It was 1913 when she died. And I did posted a pop quiz, and people thought she died in 1813. No, she was alive in the century, this past century. And so she was anti-capitalist in the work that she did. If you look at her legacy, she was very much against workers being exploited. Her whole thing was about liberation and getting as many people free as possible. And she participated in the Civil War. She participated throughout Reconstruction, and she died poor because there were no reparations programs for Black women. So then to put her on the 20, which is currency to procure property, which she was in life, is a fuck you to her and a distortion of her legacy. And it also doesn't mean that any Black women will get more access to that, because I can't remember the statistic, but Black women basically don't have access to 20s to the same extent that folks like Andrew Jackson do. And so that doesn't change anything. But there's a push right now for a telescope, clearly not a science person, a telescope to be renamed from a racist scientist to Harriet Tubman. And it was created to study the North Star. And the North Star is what she used to help people get free. I think that is a comprehensively better way to honor her than to put her on money, to have it's symbolic, right? But it's also not harmful. And it's also way more deep than just putting her on the 20 to replace Andrew Jackson. It's honoring her legacy and connecting it intimately.
That I think is beautiful. And so maybe that's the move for her in particular. But you'll admit, I assume that a telescope is far less high profile of a thing that not billions of people are going to interact with than money, physical currency. So would you support then a Black leader being on that 20? Because I think that is so important. I think one of the best parts about what has been happening in recent years, the best signs of progress, is the fact that these pushes for diversity in our programming, in our entertainment, in the things that we see in our society, are making it just so that those old white racists are just being forced to be left behind. Because look at the society around you, look at the people, look at the money, look at the things, look at the shows, look at everything. It's a multitude of color, and that is the only way that it will just be ingrained in our brains. Like you said before about you don't want things being ingrained as separate. Well, then that's the way to solve that, isn't it? To have us all just be everywhere.
I think so. I mean, for me, it was really when I went to Kenya and I saw on their currency, they have Black folks. I mean, it's Kenya. But that was just such a thing for me, because psychologically, I had never really tapped into the lack of representation. For me to see that and just see in the billboards, there's just all Black people. And I was just like, that make fucking sense. But it was also like, I am now so aware of how that is so nowhere in America. And so I think that having somebody like Madam C.J. Walker, who was herself a capitalist, she was the first, I think, millionaire Black woman, or Annie Turnbow Malone, or having Booker T. Washington, who created the National Negro Business League, which is today just the National Business League, which is like the only case of something being created for Black people and then like as an organization and then being like for everybody, a little all lives matter there. I think those are great people to be on there. But for somebody who was specifically anti-capitalist and who was enslaved, it's a little different. And so I'm not against it in principle. I'm really just trying to preserve Tubman's legacy in that case. But I think Annie Turner Malone, Nana C.J. Walker, Booker T. Washington, great candidates for that. Also, we could do the thing that Costa Rica does. They have some really cool little capuchin monkeys on their currency. We could, cycle it through every couple of years like they do in Canada. And that's been the most interesting thing to me is I've learned so much about other people's currency as it relates to this conversation. But we do have a lot of like old, dead, really fucked up white guys on our money. And it's not just the money that has to change. It also has to be about the distribution of power and money. It can't just be one or the other. And I mean, one is a good place to start, but it has to be followed swiftly with other action. So that way they can't go, hey, we painted Black Lives Matter on the floor and we're going to give the police $1 billion more. So be quiet,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it cannot just be symbolism. It has to be concrete things. But symbolism does matter sometimes. And maybe one day down the road, we'll see you on one of these dollar bills. I could see that. I would support it.
Oh my goodness. I'm going to put that in my will to specifically not do, just to spite you, Bet. No, I'm kidding. I'd be cool with that.
Where can people find you, Folly? What would you like to leave people with, Blair?
I try to communicate exclusively by carrier pigeon. I'm kidding. You can find me at Blair Imani, BLAIR IMANI. I'm very easy to get in touch with. It's almost a little bit dangerous. And so, yeah, follow me. Subscribe to my YouTube channel, which I'm, rearing into gear. I have my Smarter in Seconds on Instagram, educating reluctantly on Twitter, but still there. And my book, which is coming out at the end of the year.
Can't wait to read it. Thank you so very much for being here. And thank you all for listening. I hope this was an instructive and enlightening conversation. I loved having it. And we will see you again very soon because until next week, this has been Last Week on Earth.